Excellent. So yes, I work for EnviroCom Australia, and we are environmental consultants, and we've worked with the City of Greater Dandenong for quite a few years now, helping to facilitate their waste education programs. So we do a lot of work with their schools and community groups. So some of the most recent things we've been doing with City of Greater Dandenong is helping with the initial rollout of the food and garden waste service. So that's sort of what's been keeping us quite busy, but we also have been doing recently with International Composting Awareness Week, talking all about composting and worm farming at home. So how we can utilise our food scraps the best way to not only reduce our impact on the environment and our use of landfills, but also looking at how we can create some beautiful soil for our gardens. So a little overview of what we will talk about today. We're going to cover off some of the issues behind food waste and landfill to really drive home the importance of recycling our food and garden waste. We're also going to talk all about composting, worm farming, and Bokashi buckets when you're recycling your food scraps at home. So these are the three most common systems that we would find and be able to utilise. So what I also will do is we'll sort of stop and have a couple of little question breaks sort of as we go. So I'll stop after each of the systems that I talk about, just given that they are so quite different. It'd be good to sort of help you all and cover off those questions sort of as we go, rather than holding them all to the end. So if you do have questions sort of as we go, I'll have a little slide to say that we're stopping for questions, and you can put them through into the chat. So just to start off with a few statistics on food waste. So approximately 50% of our garbage bin is food scraps, and that percentage is by the weight. So about half of the weight of our bin is food and garden waste, most of that being food waste, because quite a few households will have the third garden waste bin. Now, this is quite a significant amount of food when we look at it more deeply in terms of how much food we're wasting. So it's not necessarily just the food scraps from our kitchens. So things like banana peels, apple cores, fruit and vegetable peelings. It's actually a lot of wasted food. So the average Victorian household throws out about $2,000 worth of food every year, which is about one shopping bag per shop. So if you think every time you go to the supermarket and you bring home your groceries, you can basically pick up one of those bags and throw it in the bin. So not only is it that waste of the food, we're also wasting that money that we've spent on that food, as well as all of that time and energy and resources that have gone into growing and harvesting that food and getting it to us at the supermarket. Now, a lot of this waste that we are throwing away, it's going into our rubbish bin at home, so the bin with the red lid. And when we send this food waste to our rubbish bins, it gets sent to landfill. So our local landfill for Greater Dandenong is in Hampton Park, so not too far away. And what's happening is this food scraps, as it's going into landfill, the reason we get the name landfill is what we're doing is we're filling our land with rubbish. So essentially, a very basic premise of a landfill is a big hole in the ground that we tip all of our rubbish into, and we sort of build it up in layers and cover it up. Because it's being covered up by sort of soil and other textile layers to try and contain it into a landfill, what's happening is this food waste is breaking down anaerobically. So it's breaking down without any air. Because it's breaking down underground without air, it's not actually turning into sort of the compost material that we would get in our gardens at home if we were using a compost bin. What's actually happening is as it starts to slowly break down over time, it's releasing a toxic gas called methane, as well as carbon dioxide. So two quite potent greenhouse gases, which we definitely don't want getting up into our atmosphere. We also get a bit of a liquid that we call leachate that can leak into the surrounding groundwater around our landfill. So the leachate picks up any sort of other chemicals and toxins that might be floating around through the landfill, which we definitely don't want happening as well. Now, a lot of our modern landfills are a lot more complicated than just a hole in the ground. There's a huge amount of engineering that goes into building and maintaining these landfills. So there is a lot of ways that we can try and capture this methane gas and this leachate. We use lots of pipes and things throughout the landfill to help capture it. A lot of modern landfills will transform that methane gas into energy, convert it into energy which can power the surrounding homes as well as other buildings on the landfill site. And that leachate can be collected and disposed of safely. But a really important thing to note is that The landfills, they don't always capture all of this gas. It's around about 80% that can get captured. So there is still going to be some pollution escaping from our landfill. So if we can start to use something like a compost bin or a worm farm to help recycle our food scraps, then we are effectively cutting our waste in half. However, you can see in our little food recovery hierarchy here on the screen that recycling is one of sort of the middle steps here when we're talking about how to avoid food waste. The best thing we can do is actually prevent food waste from happening in the first place, so that all of the food scraps that we're left with is just sort of those unavoidable food scraps. So things like a banana peel or an apple core or other vegetable peelings. If you would like more information on how to reduce your food waste at home before having to dispose of it, I would definitely suggest looking at the Love Food Hate Waste website. There's some wonderful tips on there about how to reduce food waste at home, as well as access to things like shopping lists and some safe storage guides to get the best out of your food products at home. Now, we also do want to just quickly touch on a new policy document in Victoria. It's called Recycling Victoria, a New Economy. And this is all about creating a circular economy. So moving away from what we call a linear economy, which is where we use something, we buy something, we use it, we throw it away. And instead looking at how we can consistently implement methods for removing waste safely, but also keeping products and materials in use as much as possible. So that way we're not extracting resources from our environment continuously and unnecessarily. Instead, we're sort of using what we have more effectively. It's all about regenerating our natural systems and aiming to sort of remove that need to constantly be finding new materials and new products. So composting and worm farming, recycling these food scraps at home definitely fits into that circular economy framework, because the old materials, which is the fruit and vegetable scraps, is being converted into the new material, which is compost. So we're keeping everything sort of going through a loop. If you ever hear of the term closing the loop, that's essentially what this sort of circular economy framework is. We're closing that loop so that that very small amount of landfill that we have left over is being managed effectively, and the rest is sort of being kept in the system, being used as efficiently as possible. So organic recycling is definitely a form of recycling. So what we're doing is we're taking that old material and we're turning it into something new. As I said, that new material being the compost. Now, as we go through each of these three systems, each three system at home will give you a different product and they'll have different uses, but they are all a form of organic recycling, taking that old food scraps and turning it into something new. So why do we recycle organics? We do it to save our natural resources from the environment. So minerals, water, trees, also things like our actual food scraps. They're a natural resource. We're growing them and there's a lot of effort and materials that go into growing fruit and vegetables and then transporting it to a supermarket for us. It reduces our pollution, saves landfill space, also reduces waste in our bins at home. And then we also get those wonderful benefits for our gardening at home. So when we add compost into our gardening soil, we're actually improving the soil structure. We help the soil retain more water as well as adding extra nutrients to the soil. And it also means that it's chemical free. So we don't need to go and buy or fertilizer from the gardening or hardware store. And we also know exactly what's going into it as well. So composting, we're going to start by talking all about composting. Composting is a natural way of recycling our food scraps. And what we're doing when we're putting it into a compost bin is we're just taking the natural process and sort of enhancing it to suit ourselves and to really get that benefit. In a compost bin, the majority of the work in breaking down our food scraps is actually done by bacteria and fungi. And what we do is we then control the amount of water, heat, and oxygen that goes into that compost bin to make sure that we have the best environment possible to help break our food and garden waste down as fast as possible. Now, while this compost process is happening, as I said, most of the work is done by bacteria and fungi. So microorganisms from our soil and in that compost bin, they start to break down the material to help create that new soil. Now, what they're doing is they're breaking this down through what we call aerobic respiration. So they require a lot of oxygen. And as they break it down, these microorganisms themselves are giving off carbon dioxide and heat. So sometimes we hear the term hot composting get floated around. To get a hot compost is quite difficult. It takes a lot of practice, it takes a lot of effort, but basically in terms of getting a hot compost, your compost bin will be reaching about 60 to 70 degrees. And a lot of that is due to these microorganisms working as efficiently as possible and releasing that heat. So that's not something to get too confused by. Sort of just letting you know that if you have a hot compost, you basically have a super well working compost machine. Now, also in this compost bin, we are adding the materials that we want to as well. Now, there's a few different ways that we can have a compost bin. We can have a compost actual bin structure. There's a few different types of these. Some of them will be the older sort of round dome compost bins, which sit onto the ground. Some of them will be these more square-like structures, and they have a little door at the bottom. Now, the door at the bottom is quite useful because it means that we can have a steady supply of compost and we can shovel it out from the bottom of the bin as it's ready to go and as it's matured. Whereas if you have the larger dome structures, you sort of have to wait for that whole bin to be matured compost so that you can lift the bin off, harvest the whole bin and start again. So if you're happy to wait, a dome compost bin would be suitable for you, but if you'd like that steady flow of compost for use on your garden, the one with these little doors might be a better option. Do bear in mind though that the ones with these little doors here, they can be more likely to attract vermin, so things like animals like rats and mice. So if you know that that's maybe an issue where you live, then perhaps the older dome structure might be more suitable. The other one we have here in the middle is called a tumbler. The reason it's called a tumbler, you can see the handle on it here. This tumbler is actually getting turned by us manually. Also has two little compartments. So the idea here being you would add your food and garden waste to the first compartment. When that's full, you would then start adding food and garden materials to the second compartment, giving that first one that's full a couple of weeks to finish off that compost process, and then you can harvest the compost out of the finished one. So you're sort of constantly rotating which tumbler side you're using. Another option, and this one is really suitable if you have quite a significant amount of garden material, if you have a large property, for example, is compost bays. So it's a similar concept to the tumblers in that we're sort of filling one and then we move the materials along physically. So once one sort of bay is full and we can't add any more material to it, you would then move that material across to the next bay and then the next bay. So you sort of constantly have those garden materials moving and circulating. That's helping to get a lot of that air through it. Now, if you do have the bay structures, again, if we're adding food scraps to a compost bay, given that it's out in the open, it can again attract animals to that compost pile. So if you are adding food scraps in there, making sure that you've always got garden materials on top so that the food scraps are actually buried and not sort of visible and sitting there on the surface. You can use a couple of these different systems in tandem as well. So you might have compost bays just for garden material, and then you use your compost bin for food scraps as well as garden materials as well. So I keep talking about food and garden materials. So on to what can be composted. So in your compost bins at home, whether it's the tumbler, the bays or the bins, you can add all fruit and vegetable scraps, including foods like citrus, onions and garlic. You can add all of your garden materials. You can also add coffee grounds and loose tea leaves, eggshells and cardboard. Now, paper and cardboard, although they are, yes, please avoid highly glossy or waxy paper or cardboard. So for example, magazines, which are the sort of the more glossy paper material, definitely try and keep out. If it's sort of a waxy cardboard, perhaps like a box that you might get from a fruit and vegetable store that has that wax coating on it, we don't want that in there either. But sort of that plain brown cardboard is totally fine. So things like toilet paper rolls and paper towel rolls. If you have toilet paper that's wrapped in a paper material, that paper is also fine. Newspaper is a really, really good one to put in there. Egg cartons as well, and sort of those other plain cardboard boxes too. With the eggshells, these eggshells, they're not actually going to decompose and break down in your compost bin, but what they do is they're adding extra nutrients to that soil when that's finished. So don't be alarmed if when your compost is finished and matured that you see the full eggshells still in there. That's just because they're not going to be breaking down. It is a good idea to try and dry them out and then sort of crush them or grind them up in a little grinder if you've got one. and then you can either add it to your compost bin or even just sprinkle it straight onto your garden beds. The eggshells are really helpful when we balance the acidity of our compost and our soil. Now, when we talk about compost ingredients as well, we also really focus on what type of material it is. So we refer to these materials as greens and browns. So our brown materials are really dry, they're very high in carbon, and then our green materials, they're the fresh, wet materials, and they are very nitrogen rich. Now, you will see if you're ever Googling or trying to learn about composting online, there's a lot of reference to the ratio between these two materials. Now, every single food or garden material that you have, it will have sort of a different chemical ratio of carbon versus nitrogen. When we think of it in our compost bin though, what we want to be doing is balancing the two by volume. So the best thing to do is to have twice as much dry brown material to your green material. So a nice little mantra for you to help remember that is brown is best, then add the rest. So some examples of those brown dry materials are tree prunings, dry grass clippings, dry leaves, egg cartons and the cardboard, vacuum dust. Now, vacuum dust is totally fine to go in your compost bin. However, do be mindful that if you have carpeted floors that you're vacuuming, you might not want to put that in there because you will be possibly adding sort of plastic microfibers into your compost bin, which won't be breaking down. But if you say just have floorboards throughout your house and you're vacuuming those, that would totally be fine. Now, it can often be a bit difficult sometimes, or we perceive it as difficult to keep a good supply of brown materials. Something that is really handy is if you're raking leaves or you've mown the grass at home, keep a pile to the side of your compost bin. Now they will slowly start to dry out as you're left them sitting there. This is what I do at home. I have a pile of either leaves or grass next to my compost bin, and then I can take the dried layer and add it every time I add my fruit scraps. Now, it can be a bit trickier too in a Melbourne winter where it's quite wet. So if you can store them under cover or anything like that, that's also handy too. If you don't have a lot of trees or anything in your yard, I would encourage you to go for a little walk around your neighbourhood and just collect some leaves up from the nature strip or local parks or anything like that. If you start to look around, you will always find this sort of ongoing supply of leaves, especially if you live in a leafy, beautiful suburb. Now, the green materials, they're our fresh materials. So all of our fruit and vegetable scraps are that fresh, green, wet material, as well as the fresh grass clippings, tea leaves, coffee grounds, hair, and weeds. Yes, you can add weeds to your compost bin. If you're worried about when you're sort of replanting that compost into your garden beds, what you can do is keep the weeds aside and sort of treat them in a way so that the seeds die, so that they're not going to then sort of sprout up again. Now, a way that you can do that is to put your weeds into a plastic bag with some water and leave it out in the sun for a couple of days. That should hopefully kill off any of the seeds within those weeds, and then you can add that to your compost bin. You can also leave them out in the sun, but if perhaps weeds in your compost is something that worries you or you're not sure you're doing it correctly, you can definitely just add those weeds to your garden bin at home instead of adding it to your compost bin. Some compost boosters, you can add some extra soil. So every time that you're starting up a compost bin, we definitely advise putting in a shovel or a scoop of soil from your garden, or even a scoop of finished compost from perhaps a previous compost bin. That will help add some microbes and fungi to really get your compost bin started. Horse and chicken manure are also really great components to add. They're very nitrogen rich, so they'll help add a bit of a boost to your compost bin to help get it moving too. Now, there are a few things that definitely cannot go into your compost bin. So please avoid coffee pods and tea bags. The reason we say to avoid tea bags is a lot of tea bags are made with a plastic material. It can be a mix of both paper and plastic. So it's always best to open up that tea bag and empty the tea leaves. If you do perhaps know that your tea bags that you're using are 100% paper-based, that's fine. You can put them in, they'll break down. But if you're not sure, just open them up and empty them in. Please avoid cooking oils, sauces and liquids, pet poo and animal droppings. So you can set up composting systems at home, a more of an in-ground composting system to help dispose of your cat poo and dog poo. but we won't be talking about those today. But if you are interested, if you can definitely have a search online for pet food composters, and there's a few options there for you. We do need to avoid cheese and other food items such as bread, rice, pasta, noodles, and all of our meat and bones. Our dairy, meat and bones and grains, they will start to decompose in a compost bin. So it's not that they won't break down, but it's more that they're going to attract other pests. So those rats and mice again, and even foxes, depending on where we live. These types of foods can also introduce a foodborne disease to your compost, which can be harmful as well if we're then going to put that compost on a vegetable garden or fruit trees. Although, yes, the compost bin is going to generate some heat, it won't be enough to kill off any bacteria and diseases that might be present in our meat and cheese products. So we definitely want to be keeping them out. A few little tips for using your compost bin. Definitely, biggest one is to make sure that you're removing all types of packaging. So that includes all of your fruit stickers and any rubber bands, any other plastic bits that might be around your fruit and vegetables, such as the plastic on the cucumber in the little picture there. Given that these materials are plastic, they will not break down in your compost bin. It's always a good tip as well to have what we would call a little caddy or a container that you would store in your kitchen, preferably on your kitchen bench close to where you're preparing your food, so that you can put your food scraps into that little container or bucket, and you can then carry that out to your compost bin for emptying. Always best to have that closer than your garbage bin, in like proximity to where you're preparing food. So making it as easy as possible for you to have that nearby to pop your food scraps in to carry out. Now, something else that you can do as well is to make sure that your compost bin is in a really easily accessible place. So if it's down the back in your garden, if it's in a really hard to reach spot, we're less likely to use it. So we want to be able to set these systems up so that it's a really easy habit to form, and it's not a huge effort to have to go out and empty the compost bin or something like that. I can certainly testify to that as well. I have a compost bin at home with my family. It used to be up sort of in the back corner of our garden, and nobody would empty the kitchen caddy except me. So I moved it a little bit closer to our back door. It's sort of near our clothesline now, and the rest of the family goes out and empties the kitchen caddy. It's a lot easier to get to, which is very handy. So I'm going to play a quick little video for you about how to set up a compost bin. Now, I do apologise because the volume's quite low on this video that I'm about to play. So if you do have your volume up, I would suggest turning it up all of the way. And I'll talk through this video afterwards as well in terms of the steps of what we're doing. Hopefully it wants to play. Apologies. I have notoriously bad internet connection at my house. This possibly might not wanting to be working today. It's one of the bonuses from working from home at the moment, dealing with a dodgy internet connection. Let's see. No, apologies, I don't think it wants to play. It's just doing a little loading symbol for me today. So I will just have to talk you through it. So when we set up a compost bin at home, you want to be choosing a beautiful, nice sunny spot in your garden. Now, although I said that a lot of the heat that generates from the compost bin is actually from the microorganisms breaking down our food waste, putting your compost bin directly in a sort of area with pure sunlight, so not under the cover of any trees or shrubs, that heat from the sun will help accelerate that process a little bit more. We also want the location to be nice and flat because we need the whole base of that bin to be in the contact with bare soil. Now, if you have a tumbler bin, then that's not necessarily an issue in terms of having the base flat with the soil, because obviously it's a raised system, but you still will want it to be flat so it's not going to topple over as it gets a bit heavier with the food contents and garden contents in there as well. It's always really great as well if you're using one of the bin systems to sort of break up the soil a little bit with a shovel before placing the bin down. It just sort of breaks that soil up a little bit and helps those microorganisms come up a little bit more by breaking the surface, especially if you're placing it on sort of thick grass. Sort of shoveling at it and breaking that up is a good way to start. We also then want to start with a layer of sticks. So once you pop your compost bin down onto the ground, adding a small layer of sticks for aeration. So sort of small sticks, break them up. You won't need more than a foot at the bottom of your bin. It's just so that the food and garden materials aren't sitting flush on the soil, and to sort of add a bit of air layers underneath. We then start adding our materials. So what we want to do when we add our materials is to actually layer them in greens and browns. Now, the picture here sort of shows you what that might look like, but obviously that's just a bit more of a cross section. Yours will look a lot more mixed up once we actually get the process going. As I mentioned before, it's good to add some finished compost or soil from your garden. Just sort of one sort of shovel full or a couple of handfuls will be completely enough. And after we've started adding our materials, we also want to make sure that we mix it and aerate it regularly. So at least once a week, we're wanting to be getting out into our garden, mixing our compost bin to help get as much air going through that compost bin as possible. And then when that compost is finished, we harvest it. We harvest it by either removing the whole bin altogether and harvesting that entire bin, or taking it out from the bottom of the bin where the little doors are, or out of the compartments for the tumbler. If you have any unbroken down material on top, so material that hasn't decomposed, you can use that to sort of take it off the top and use that to start your next compost bin. I will talk a little bit more about how to harvest compost and how to turn it and aerate it in a moment. Before I do, just like to also really drill home as well that we don't have to necessarily go out and buy a brand new compost bin. If we can upcycle one or reuse sort of something else, that's always sort of the best option, so that we're not sort of purchasing something brand new. The ones that are the most easiest to make at home would probably be the open bay compost system. So if you can find some recycled pallets or timber, even chicken wire is a good one as well. You can build them yourself. You can even build your own tumbler systems too. So there's a nice little picture there of an old wine barrel that someone's transformed into a compost tumbler, but you can also fashion sort of any old bin into a compost bin as well. Now, when we're talking about care and maintenance for our compost bin, we refer to something called the Adam recipe. So really knuckle down and remember this, because if anything you ever find perhaps isn't quite working well with your compost bin, maybe it's not going to working very well, it might be getting a bit smelly, etc. You go back to this Adam recipe, 9 times out of 10, the issue that you're having can go back to one of these 4 things. So the A stands for aliveness, and that's to do with the critters, the fungi. So having that bacteria and fungi in our compost bin. So we said that you can use soil from your garden or some already finished compost to help add microbes and fungi to your compost. Other little critters that you might see in your compost bin, we're not necessarily going to add insects and bugs into our compost bin, but if they're there, if you see them, that's a really good sign that your compost bin is happy and thriving. So worms is one of the best signs of that. So if worms are coming up from your surrounding garden into your compost bin and choosing to live there, then that's a really good sign that you've got quite a good little ecosystem going. So other little critters that you might see, so maybe slaters, bugs, millipedes, beetles, centipedes, they're all perfectly fine in there. Even spiders, if they don't bother you, they'll all just happily live together in your compost bin. The worms as well, and these bugs, beetles and things like that, they will also help to create some little air pockets in your compost bin too, which is always great. And they will also sort of eat away at that compost material too. The D stands for diversity, so having a good mix of green and brown materials. So just remembering every time you add your food and garden scraps to always make sure that you're adding another bucket or 2, container or 2, handful or 2, whatever it might be, of your dried garden materials too. The A stands for compost, A stands for air, so always making sure that we're adding air to our compost. You can do that in a few different ways, which I'll show you in the next slide. And then the M stands for moisture. So our compost bin, we don't want it to be too wet, we don't want it to be too dry. If we're adding too much food scraps or fresh garden materials, that's when our compost bin is going to get really wet, and it's usually when it starts to get a bit smelly too. So for example, if you find that your compost is a bit too wet and sloppy, there's too much food material in there, to help combat that, what you would then do is add extra dry material. So making sure we add some additional brown dried leaves or grass or paper and cardboard, something like that, to help soak up that moisture and fix that balance of materials. Likewise, if you're finding that it's really dry, it might be really slow, it's not breaking down at all because there's too much dry garden materials in there, we can just add some liquid as well. So whether that be additional food scrap materials or adding actual liquid. So one example of that, if you know it's going to rain, you could leave the lid open on your compost bin to get some rain in, or you can use leftover cooking water, water from a flower vase, leftover tea or coffee, things like that. So here's how we can aerate our compost bin. You can use a bit of a garden fork. A garden fork's the best one to use if you have a base system, using a garden fork to get in there and turn it. The easiest one for a compost bin is this compost turner. It's also referred to as a compost mate. You can see it's got a little bit of a corkscrew sort of style at the bottom. And what you're going to do is you put that into your compost bin, turn it around, and then pull it back up. So as you turn it, it will sort of move down through the compost layers. And then as you pull it up, that both mixes the materials around and also helps fluff a bit of air into it too. Something to note as well, when you are adding paper and cardboard to your compost bin, if you can scrunch up the newspaper or sort of tear it up, that will help add a bit of air to your compost bin as well, especially dried leaves, because they're not compact, they're quite loose and fluffy. They'll add a bit of air layers in there as well. Something else you can do is you can fashion, and if you've got some old PVC pipe, something like that, you can drill some holes into it. And when you set your compost bin up, you would put that through the middle of your compost bin, and that will sort of help create a consistent airflow through it. But obviously you're not going to be putting the food scraps or garden materials through the middle of the pipe. It'll sort of be around it within the compost bin. You can buy a bin called an aero bin, and that has this built into it, but they are quite expensive. So it's a nice little DIY way of doing it yourself at home. How do you know your compost is ready? Now, I love sharing this picture. It helps me practice what I preach. This is my compost bin from home. You can see the bottom of the compost here. It's quite a rich, dark brown color. Compost should be dark and crumbly. It shouldn't be really, really dry like mulch. It should be like soil. It should smell like soil too. It should have a really rich and earthy smell. It shouldn't have a foul or off-putting smell at all. And you also shouldn't have any visible or whole pieces of food and garden waste. Now, as I did dig this out, I did see sort of some of the larger things that might have been left behind. So things like an avocado peel take a little bit longer to break down, as well as avocado pips, mango pips, eggshells as well. If you're happy to dig them through your garden when you're using this compost, that's fine. Otherwise, you can pull those sort of bigger bits out and add it to your new compost bin. So obviously I didn't add this top layer of garden waste back into my garden. I would take that off and use that to help start my new compost bin. So it's a nice little visual to get you picturing what your compost bin should look like when you remove it. So I have one of the dome bins as well. So I have to take the whole bin off as well. And you can see also my little compost mate in the background too. So I have another video. Let's see if this one wants to work for me today. And this one is how to harvest our compost.
If you're using a single compost bin at home, you can always harvest a bit of mature compost right from the bottom of the pile that is ready to use and sprinkle on the garden. If you're using 2 compost bins at home, leave your full compost bin to mature for 6 to 8 weeks.
Apologies.
Start a second bin for your continuing supply of fresh food scraps and garden waste, and then rotate the bins as the mature compost is harvested from your oldest bin. Once you've got your mature compost, I love using it as a potting mix to grow some herbs and edible greens. And I love using it as a mulch around some plants that need a little bit of tender, loving care. Thanks for joining us in our tutorial. Happy composting.
So as that video said there, it does take a few weeks for your compost to sort of be ready and completely mature to be used on your garden. If you have a really, really well high functioning compost bin, everything's going super, super well, you're a brilliant composter, you've been doing it for a long time, you might find that it only takes maybe 6 to 8 weeks for you to get a fully formed compost, especially if you've got quite a bit of a hot compost going and the temperature's nice and high as well. You've got that really great balance of green and brown materials. Won't take too long, takes 6 to 8 weeks. Realistically though, it's probably going to take a little bit longer for your compost to be ready. So that picture I showed you of my compost bin, that was probably about a year that it took for that compost to be ready and harvested. That's also a lot due to the fact that I didn't leave it sit. I was always adding materials. So if you are really keen on using that compost on your gardens, it's quite often handy to have 2 compost bins going. So once one bin's full of materials, what you would then do is obviously set up your second compost bin and start adding your materials to that. Whereas the sort of fully finished compost bin that you can't fit any more into, what you would do is you would mix and turn it still once or twice a week, make sure you're getting that airflow through it, but leaving it for a couple of weeks longer, allowing all of that food and garden waste to break down and form that compost material. And sort of that's when it takes 6 to 8 weeks. So when you've stopped adding materials to it, not obviously once you've been sort of continuously adding to it, it's going to take a lot longer because we're always adding new materials. Now, the little slide that I have here on the screen, this is a bit of a troubleshooting guide, and most of these things here will revert back to what I called that Adam recipe before. Now, I'm not going to read through all of these here. I don't want to do that to you, but I will also say, I should have said at the start as well, if you do want a copy of these slides, if you can, please, I will share my email, or perhaps ask our moderators to share my email in the chat, and you can email me directly and I'll send you a copy of these slides, and that way you'll have sort of these troubleshooting guides as well. But yeah, they all sort of will tend to go back to that Adam recipe. So looking at the aliveness, the diversity, the aeration, and the moisture. So what we're going to do now is sort of stop and have a little break for questions. If anyone has any questions, just a reminder again to pop them into that little chat. It doesn't look like we've got any coming through so far. What we will be talking about next is the worm farming and also Bokashi bins. So I'm going to talk about Bokashi bins first, because Bokashi bins, they work really well in conjunction with a compost bin at home. They are a really great system to sort of use in balance together. Now, a Bokashi bin, it's a little bit different to a compost bin. We're actually using something that's a fermentation process rather than just that natural process that we talked about with the compost. It's a fermentation process. So what happens with the Bokashi bucket is when the materials have finished fermenting in the bucket, we need a place to put them. So that compost bin could be a pretty good place to start. Alrighty, so I've just seen that Barney has asked a question about how we can get them into community gardens. It is hard to work out who has the responsibility for a compost bin. A lot of community gardens, the way that they are set up in a community garden is that community members pay for plots. I've seen community gardens work really well where people will just have their own compost bin. So they'll have a compost bin next to their own plot, or a system where they've sort of built it into the garden beds. It's more of an in-ground composter. And that can work really well because then you're not relying on other people to be responsible for that compost. Whoever's got the plot is responsible for their own compost bin. Can be a bit trickier when there's less space. So you'll also see some community gardens where there's more of a communal compost, and you generally do need to sort of ensure that you have at least one person that's sort of in charge of maybe the maintenance of it. We've often done, through EnviroCom, we do these types of workshops on composting, but we'll actually go out to the community garden and we'll host a workshop with the community garden members so that everybody is across how to use that compost bin efficiently. The biggest one is to make sure that, as we said, that balancing of the 2 materials. So if we do have a community garden with a communal compost bin, ensuring that everybody knows that if they're adding that fresh food scrap materials, that they're also adding the brown materials at the same time. And then as they're adding the materials, if they mix and turn it. So if everyone's doing that, that compost bin should work quite well, but you still would perhaps have to have 1 or 2 community members who are responsible for sort of keeping an eye on that bin. So I agree, it can be tricky, but it's definitely possible to balance and have it work effectively as well. So I will pop through now onto Bokashi buckets. So as I said, a Bokashi bucket is more of a fermentation process that's turning our food waste into a material for use in our gardens. Now, this is a little bit different to composting. Composting, we need a huge amount of air going through our compost. So it's what we call aerobic composting. A Bokashi bucket, on the other hand, is anaerobic. So we want it to keep it absolutely airtight, which is why our Bokashi buckets that we have and purchase have a really well-sealed lid. When we're using a Bokashi bin, we're also using something called effective microorganisms. It's a good bacteria, and this bacteria is helping to break down the food scraps in a safe way so that we remove any bad bacteria. And it also helps speed up the process as well in terms of that fermentation. A lot of this effective microorganisms, or EM material, it can be a liquid or a powder. If it's a powder, it's usually a type of grain or bran that's then sprayed with the microorganisms which help break down food. Or it can also be a liquid that you'll get in a spray bottle that you can spray onto the foods to distribute those microorganisms. And as I said, this bin will sort of only partially compost the food waste, and then we need to complete the process by adding it to a compost bin or burying it into the ground. So not only do we get that material that we add to compost or bury into the ground, which helps our garden and our soil, we also get a liquid fertilizer too. So you can see in the picture here, it's got a little tap. So that's where we get the liquid that drains out of it. Now, the reason I said a Bokashi bucket works really well in tandem with a compost bin is because we can add absolutely any food scraps to a Bokashi bin. And that includes all of our grains, our meat, whether it's cooked or raw, all of our dairy products too, eggs. So if you've got any egg scraps as well as the egg shells. And because we're adding those effective microorganisms, it doesn't matter if that meat is off, if it's moldy, if it's raw, because that effective microorganisms, that good bacteria, is going to help break that food down. And also because it's fermenting as well, that helps remove it too. Now, excuse me, you can also add things like coffee bags, and it's not coffee bags, sorry, tea bags and tea leaves, coffee grinds. Again, just noting with the tea bags, making sure that they don't have any plastic within them. If you're not sure, just tear open that tea bag. You can also add tissues and paper towel to this as well. Now, when we add the mix, the effective enzymes to the Bokashi mix, it's really important that it's actually covering all of the food scraps. So what you don't want to be doing is just filling up that whole bin, your Bokashi bin, with food scraps and then sprinkling or spraying a layer on top. You need to make sure that all of the food has some sort of covering of that material. So we've also said that it needs to be really airtight and anaerobic. So we don't want to be constantly opening and closing the lid as we're preparing food in the kitchen. So it's always good to have a little kitchen caddy still when you're using this. And then when your kitchen caddy is full or your container's full, then adding it to the Bokashi bin. So adding a bit of food scraps, adding that Bokashi mix, adding more food scraps, adding the Bokashi mix, so that you've not got the whole bin full of food before we're adding that Bokashi mix. I hope that's clear and makes sense. Now, what we also need to do is squash this food down as much as possible, because we need to remove all of that air in between the layers of food. You can purchase a bit of an add-on with most Bokashi bins, like what you see here. It's a bit of a masher, helps you squash down all the food. You can just use something like a potato masher that you might already have in your kitchen, that you might sort of purchase one or set aside to use as well. So every time we add these food scraps, making sure we push it all down as much as possible. That helps remove the air and also helps push down any liquids too, and keeping that lid sealed, and making sure that we drain it regularly as well. Now, what's going to happen is once this Bokashi bin's full and we can't add any more materials to it, we need to let it sit for 2 weeks to continue to let it to ferment. So try not to open and close that lid constantly as well. You might open it maybe once or twice a week just to push that down, the food material down, and keep removing that air. And you will still need to drain that liquid. Now, I said before that that liquid is a really great fertilizer for your garden. It's also incredibly strong. So what we need to do for our Bokashi liquid as we drain it is we need to mix it in a ratio of 1 to 100. So 1 part Bokashi liquid to 100 parts water. And then you can use it as a liquid fertilizer for your plants in your garden. I would still be mindful, because it is so strong, not to be pouring it straight onto the leaves of any plant. So perhaps just around the base is the best way to go to make sure that we don't damage the plants. Now, you do need to use it within 24 hours of draining it, because once it hits air, then those microorganisms in it will, and good bacteria will start to die. So we do need to use it straight away. You can add it to a septic tank as well. That's totally fine. And you can also pour it down the sink as well. Sort of a bit of a natural drain cleaner, so to say. Now, after you've let the material in the bin sit for about 2 weeks when it's finished to ferment, you can then empty your Bokashi bucket by digging it into a patch in your garden bed. You can choose to just leave it in the garden bed, walk away and forget about it. Otherwise, you can dig it back up and use it as compost. So you might want to be using it to put into some potting mix or something like that. You can dig it up and do that, or you can just leave it be. The other thing you can do is add it to your compost bin. Because we've fermented those materials and we've had that Bokashi mix through it, it means that any meat products that are in it or dairy products are safe to then add to your compost bin. So that's really good, why we say that they work well together. Again, it's good to have 2 if you can, because obviously once one's full, you can't be adding any more materials to it. You need to let it sit to ferment. So if you have a second one that you can get started on, that's a really good way to go. So a few Bokashi tips for you, same as the compost bin, making sure you've got a kitchen caddy close by so that we're not opening and closing that lid of the Bokashi bin constantly. The biggest thing to remember is to remove the air. So keeping that lid closed and sealed nice and tight, but also ensuring that we're always, when we do have it open and adding materials, that we're squishing and removing all of the air out of it. Now, because we're fermenting this material, yes, it is going to have a little bit of a smell, but it shouldn't be overly offensive. It will just have that pickled sort of smell to it. So a good storage place for a Bokashi bin would be somewhere like a laundry. You can keep it outside, that's fine too, but perhaps avoid keeping it in the direct sunlight, keeping it in sort of an undercover shady spot. And if you do see any mold, white mold is fine. White mold is totally okay in your Bokashi bin. Don't worry about that. But if it is black or any other color, then we would suggest just getting rid of that Bokashi and starting again. So just burying it into the ground and starting it again, or just putting it into your, bagging it up and putting it into your garbage bin as well. Excuse me. And again, another question from Barney, thank you, is there anything we can do that means that we don't have to buy anything from the store? I presume that you're meaning in reference to a Bokashi bin. You can DIY a Bokashi bin as well. If you're DIYing a Bokashi bin, the best way to do that, I don't think I have any pictures, sorry, is, just check back through, no, is to get 2 buckets. So if you have 2 buckets, drill some holes into the bottom of one and place them in each other. So that way you've got that bottom bucket is going to be collecting the liquid. You can also fashion a tap to it if you like, or you can just take off the bucket to empty the liquid out of it. And then you have a lid as well. That's the easiest DIY to do it, just making sure that the lid's quite tight. Oh, and Barney, you just confirmed for me, you meant the Bokashi mix. I don't believe you can make it yourself at home. You do have to purchase it to buy. Now, it does mean that if you have a Bokashi bin, that there is an ongoing cost to having and using a Bokashi bin at home, but a bag of the Bokashi mix or a bottle of the liquid, that should last you around 6 months. So it's not as if you're going to have to be going out and buying this super regularly. It's just maybe once or twice a year that you'll be making that purchase. And depending on the brand and the amount that you're buying, so if you're buying it in bulk, it'll be a bit cheaper. And I'm not too sure about the price differences between the liquid and the grain. I don't think there's too much of a difference as well. Okay, do we have, so if you have, that's sort of it for Bokashi. Bokashi is sort of kept short and sweet because there's really not a whole much to it. You're adding your materials, you're adding your Bokashi mix, and you're just making sure that you're removing all of that air and liquid, either adding it to your compost bin or digging it into the garden. That's pretty much all there is to Bokashi. It's nice and easy. So if anyone has any other questions about a Bokashi system, please pop them into that little chat so that I can answer them for you. And up next, we're going to be talking about worm farming. And once we've finished off with worm farming, that's a little bit more involved than what we've just had with the Bokashi. I will touch very briefly on Council's new food and garden organics bin collection, as well as a little bit of a table to sort of help you decide what system suits you. We've had a question from Chris asking if we could see Council implementing a rebate system. We don't Greater Dandenong does not have a rebate system at the moment. There is a website called Compost Revolution, which you can jump online and you will actually find systems at a bit more of a discounted cost compared to if you were to buy it from your local gardening or hardware store. So that's perhaps an option if you're looking for a little bit of a cheaper way to get started. They sell them at sort of below the recommended retail price because they sort of buy them in bulk and are selling them in bulk. They can do so for a little bit cheaper. And I apologize because I'm a external facilitator. I don't know if that's something that council will be pursuing in the future as well. But that's perhaps something I can get in touch and ask about so that I know for next time. Okay, so worm farming. So worm farming, completely different system again, and it's also referred to as vermicomposting because what we're doing is the worms are actually breaking down our organic waste. A worm farm is really well suited if you've got a small yard or perhaps no garden, because this will just take food scraps. We can't put any garden materials into our worm farm systems. Like the Bokashi, they're also quite low maintenance. Worms that we have in our worm farms, they're called, it's a bit confusing, they're called compost worms, but they're not what we would find in our compost bin. They're different species, so we would purchase these composting worms to add to our worm farm to eat our food scraps. It is a lot faster process than composting because these worms are very efficient. They can eat twice their body weight in a day, so they can get through quite a large amount of food scraps. And we get two types of fertilizers from a worm farm. We get the castings, which is basically the worm's poo, and we get a liquid fertilizer, which is sort of a watery liquid as well, filled with wonderful nutrients. Now, a worm farm, though, we can't put every type of food waste in there. It's just our fruit and vegetables, but minus a few. So we can't add citrus to our worm farm. The reason we can't add any citrus is because worm farms don't like a very acidic soil. They like a very basic pH level in their soil. So if we add citrus, a lot of citrus fruit, we can really increase the acidity of the worm farm and it becomes a sort of a not very nice environment for them to live in. We also don't add any garlic, onion or chili. They're sort of very strong smells and flavors. Chili, for example, is very spicy. Worms are quite small and delicate, so we don't want to affect them with chili. And then we also, same as our compost bin, we're not adding meat, breads, milk, dairy, cheese, anything like that. Again, because they can harbour bacteria, which we don't want getting into our worm farms. They also just don't really prefer those foods. They prefer fruit and vegetables. You can add a little bit of leaves and grass, but if you do, I would suggest just dried leaves and dried grass and sort of leaving them on the very top layer of your worm farm. They're not really going to eat that material. They will, but they're going to eat the food scraps first. So you don't really need to add it. Again, you can add vacuum and dust, but being mindful of carpet and those plastic fibres. You can add hair, a bit of torn up paper and cardboard, tea and coffee. Again, just that reminder with the tea bags, making sure that it's not a plastic based tea bag and it's 100% paper, otherwise just tearing it open and adding the tea leaves. Now, the smaller the food items, the faster the worms will eat it. Worms don't have teeth and they're actually eating the food as it's decaying. So as this food naturally starts to break down, if you imagine, say, a banana peel, it gets a bit slimy and gross around the edges. That's the food breaking down and the worms are sucking on that decomposing material rather than the food itself. So if you do have the time or the capacity to cut your fruit and vegetable scraps up into small pieces, even putting it through a food processor or a blender, that will help speed up the amount of food that the worms can eat. When we have a worm farm, regardless of if we're building one or ourselves doing a DIY or if we're purchasing one, they all have the same premise, and that is that they have a lid, they have layers. The top layer is where we feed our worms. We can refer to it as the kitchen because it's where all their food goes. We'll then also place a bit of a protective blanket over the top of the worms. You can buy these made out of hessian. You can use your own hessian if you've got any. The best you can use is some wet paper or cardboard. The best paper you can use is a few sheets of newspaper. That blanket, it helps keep the light out of the worm farm and also helps keep it nice and cool and moist. So always making sure that whatever blanket you're using, that it's damp and moist. The ideal temperature range for worms is about 20 to 23, 24 degrees. So we don't want them getting too hot. We don't want them getting too cold. The middle layer that we have in a worm farm, it's just a bit of space for them. It's a bit of respite for them, I guess. When we have a worm farm and we're first adding our worms, starter boxes of worms, there are about 1,000 worms in them. Our worms will double their population in 2 to 3 months. So you end up with quite a large worm population. So having that extra space in there, it just gives them a chance to move away from their food and not always having to be up in that active layer. The bottom layer is where the liquid is going to collect, which we would then collect as that liquid fertilizer for our gardens. Some bought ones will have sort of an extra tray, so they might have the larger holes in these layers, so some of the castings will fall down to be collected. Some, the holes will be smaller and it'll just be the liquid. It depends on what system you're purchasing. All right, we're going to try again with another video. We'll see how it goes. And this is how to set up a worm farm. And no, I don't think it's going to work. My apologies. I just had these videos in there to break up me talking, but that's fine. I can just keep talking and tell you how we do it. So it was just talking through the layers and how we're going to set these worm farms up. When you purchase a worm farm from a gardening or hardware store, it will come with something called a coir block. It's a coconut coir. It's made out of the fibers from the coconut shell. Starts off as a nice little peat block. What we do is we add it to a bucket of water. It then expands, and that's what we use as the bedding for our worms in the top layer. If you're using additional layers, you might need to purchase a second coir block, or so that you've got bedding in that second layer too, because we don't want them just obviously sitting on that plastic of the trays. We want to give them bedding. So that coconut coir becomes the bedding for the worms. When we purchase the worms, the box or packet that they're coming in, they'll usually be on a type of manure as well. So we're tipping all of that in. A worm farm, as I said, they don't like a very cold environment. They don't like a very hot environment. So the ideal location for your worm farm is actually going to be inside. So a good spot could perhaps be in your garage, or again in the laundry. If you've got a spare cupboard, you can pop it in there where it's nice and dark. If you don't have the space and it does need to go outside, that's fine. But please just ensure that your worm farm is undercover, because if it rains, the lid of worm farms will have holes into it because they're animals, they need air to breathe. If it's sitting out in the rain, we can flood the worm farm. Worms can't breathe underwater, they will drown, because there's obviously no way for that water to then drain out. So it needs to be undercover, and it also needs to be in a very shady position. If you are keeping your worm farm outside, please be really mindful in the summer months that the worms aren't getting too hot. If you can bring it inside, that's a great idea if you can. If not, something you can do is to get sort of a container, fill it with water and freeze it. And then you can put that sort of frozen ice block on top of the worm's blanket. So not underneath where they're living and where their food is, but putting it on top, and so that can sort of help naturally cool that worm farm down in the summer. And also making sure that their blanket is nice and moist too. Once we've added our worms into that very top layer, we do want to leave them for about a week or so for them to get comfortable in their new environment. So we don't want to be feeding them for about a week. They will eat that coconut coir fiber that they're in. If they're in manure, they might also be eating that as well. So don't worry that they're not getting food for a week. They'll be okay. They'll be eating what's around them. And then once we have let them settle in a little bit, that's when we start to add their food. So their food scraps goes in the top layer, and we pull back the blanket, put the food scraps in, cover it back up again. Keeping our worms happy. So the biggest one is drainage. So in a worm farm, each of the layers, so each of these layers you have in a worm farm, they'll have little holes in each of these layers. That's allowing the worms to move up and down between the layers, and also allows the liquid to sort of leak out and drain down to that very bottom layer. If you have any blockages in those holes, the soil that they're living in, the castings, it might start to get really wet and gluggy, and that's because the liquid's not draining down. So if that's happening, you can check that the little holes aren't blocked. And you also can sort of, keep fluffing up those castings, so mixing them around to get a bit of air in there if it is really, really wet, and adding a bit of sort of dry materials to help soak up any of that excess liquid before it drains out can help as well. As I said, they don't like a very acidic soil, so If you do find that your worm farm's getting quite smelly, it could be that the food scraps are taking longer to break down than what the worms can eat them. So what you can do is you can sort of mix those food scraps through the castings that are in there to sort of add a bit of airflow through it, cover them up a little bit. That can help remove some of the smell, reduces the acidity of the soil too. Something else you can add is eggshells. So if you, as I mentioned with the compost bin earlier, dry your eggshells out and crush them down, and then you can sprinkle that on top. You can also buy worm farm conditioners. So it does the same thing. It's just to balance the pH of the soil. You can purchase it, or even lime or dolomite as well that you can purchase from gardening stores too. You can sprinkle a bit of a layer on top of their food. So air, as we said, worms, living creatures, they require oxygen. So making sure that our lid has holes in it. If you're purchasing a worm farm, they will already have that in there. But if you're building one DIY yourself, you'll need to make sure that you drill air holes into the lid. Food, obviously they need food. Best way to feed your worms is regular, small quantities. Now we get asked a lot about how often to feed them, how much to feed them. And I can't really give you that answer because it totally depends on your worm farm and your worm populations. So you'll just need to keep an eye on it. That's the best guide as to how much food they need. If they have no food in there and they've eaten it all, give them some more. If it's getting a bit moldy and smelly, they're not getting through it, you're adding too much food or feeding them too regularly. We don't want to be filling that whole container up. It's just a small layer of food on top. Worms that we purchase and use in a worm farm are what we call surface feeders, but they're coming up to the surface to feed. Unlike a worm compost bin where it's earthworms coming up from the garden, they'll eat and move throughout it as they please. These specific species that we have in a worm farm don't like that type of environment. So if you have a really thick layer of food scraps, you're going to be less inclined to come up to feed. So just a small thin layer of food just to cover the top layer of castings will be enough. As I said, they will double their population in 2 to 3 months. So you will find after a few months an established worm farm, they'll go through more food because there's more worms and they're probably quite more used to their environment too. And then the other thing to look at is temperature, which I think I've covered up as well. So making sure they're under cover and not keeping them out in the sun. Inside is the best place for them. So again, another little troubleshooting guide for you. As I said, at the end of this, I will pop my email into this chat too, so that if you're interested in these slides and then you can have these troubleshooting guides, I can send you through the slides. So how do we harvest the castings? Now, you'll know that your castings are ready because it just looks like soil. And again, like our compost bin, it has a really rich, earthy smell. Now, it is a little bit of work to get these castings because obviously the worms are living within the worm farm. So there's 2 techniques that we can use to harvest these castings. The castings in the worm farm, they will be a lot denser than just soil in your garden. So they have a bit more of a higher water content, sort of an in-between of sort of dirt and mud. So what you can do to harvest them is on a nice sunny day, but not too hot of a day, keep our worms happy, is you can dig out a bit of a section of the worm farm, stick it on some newspaper or cardboard on a table outside. And what you're going to do is you're going to form a bit of a pyramid with these castings. And what's going to happen is these worms, they don't like the light, they don't like the heat. They're going to bury down through that soil back down to the bottom as much as possible. So what you can then do, scoop off that little top layer of your mound, pop it in a bucket, pluck out any stray worms that you see and add them back to your worm farm, and then keep building that pyramid of soil up and up and up. And then that way, essentially what you should be left with at the end is just castings in your bucket that you've placed aside. But just again, being mindful that there's no little worms left behind. The idea as well when you're harvesting your castings that you're not trying to harvest the entire tray, because if you're doing this pyramid technique, because the worms might not have anywhere else to be. But if you have that middle tray that's full of that bedding already, that extra space for them to move up and down, then that's not so much of an issue, but it's just more being mindful if you've just got the one top layer and that you're not taking away their entire home of where they're living. Something else you can do, takes a little bit longer, is what we call the wait and see technique. Now you can do this in 2 ways. If you have a spare tray, what you would do is the top tray where all of the worms' food is, you're then going to move that sort of into the middle of your into the middle of your worm farm. So you'll take your spare non-used tray or perhaps that middle tray and move it and sit it on top of your worm farm so that you have a new top layer. What you then do is you start to feed your worms in that new top layer, again, making sure that it's got fresh bedding, and slowly the worms will migrate back up to that top tray and where they will eat the food, meaning that your new middle layer, which used to be their feeding layer, is just the castings. Again, you might have to go through it and just pull out any stray worms because they'll obviously still be moving up and down. This does take a little while. I've done this at home not too long ago, about a month ago. I did this with my worm farm, and it did take about 4 to 5 weeks for the worms to sort of completely migrate back up to the new top layer. So just do be mindful that it will take them a little bit of time. So if you're happy to wait, this is a good one to do because it's not very labor intensive. You're just moving the trays around. If you don't have an additional layer, what you can do is move all of the castings you have to one side of your tray, lay down fresh bedding on the second side, add the food scraps on your new fresh side, and the worms will move sort of across to where the fresh food is and the fresh bedding. As I said, the castings is basically the worms' poo, and the worms, they're not really going to like living in just their poo. They prefer that fresh bedding and the fresh food, so that you will find that they will migrate to the fresh bedding side. Again, it'll still take a little bit of time for them to move across, but that's sort of another way that you can do it too. And then how do you use these castings? You can use it in any way you like. You can dig it straight into the soil of your garden beds. You can use it in pot plants. You can even just spread it around the base of trees or shrubs to add a bit of fertilizer just straight to the base as well. That's totally fine. Again, that liquid, that worm liquid, worm juice, worm tea, whatever you like to call it, similar to the Bokashi liquid, it's high in nutrients and quite strong, so we do need to dilute it. For the worm liquid though, we dilute it 1 part worm juice to 10 parts water. So it's a little bit like mixing cordial. So sort of not as potent as the Bokashi mix, but we do still need to dilute it. And again, then we just use that as a liquid fertilizer for our plants. So you can water your plants with that fertilizer too. Now you can DIY, make your own worm farm. That's really easy. Always just ensuring that you have the same structure. So having a lid, making sure that there's holes in the lid so that the worms can breathe. The easiest way to do it, which is how I do it at work and how I have them set up for myself at home, is getting some plastic storage containers. So your top and middle layer, making sure that you drill holes in the bottom so that the worms can move up and down and the liquid can drain down. And then you have your bottom layer for the liquid to collect. You can fashion a tap into it, or I'm a bit lazy for that. I just take the containers off and tip the bucket out when it gets full. You can also make them from polystyrene boxes. It's a bit easy to add the holes because you can just poke them through with a pen or a screwdriver or something like that. Whereas with the plastic, you will need a drill. You can also make them out of an old tire, but you do need to make sure that it's got a base to it. So popping it down on a piece of old wood or something like that so the worms can't escape down through the soil in your garden. And again, just making sure there's also a layer on top to keep them safe. So having that blanket. A lot of schools and kinders make a worm farm out of a bathtub. They might have obviously a lot more food scraps than your average household. If you're interested in how to make your own worm farm, there's a couple of videos on YouTube through Gardening Australia, which talk you through how to make them and set them up, because there is sort of a few steps involved and a little bit longer time frame than what I have to talk to you today. And Gardening Australia too, just to give them a little plug, they have a great YouTube channel with heaps of videos about how to compost and harvest your compost and what to use it for and all that sort of thing too. So what system is best for you? A lot of this is going to come down to what materials you have. So if you have a lot of garden materials, then a compost bin or the bays is going to suit you better than a worm farm or a Bokashi bucket. Also comes down to the amount of space you have. So if you don't have a lot of space, then the worm farm and Bokashi bucket might be more suitable for you. But you do just have to remember with a Bokashi bucket that you have to place that material somewhere else to finish composting and fermenting. So when that bucket's finished fermenting, you need to place that material somewhere. So whether you're digging that into a garden bed or adding it to a compost bin. Now, if you do have a Bokashi bucket and you don't have anywhere to put that materials, there is options for you. So there's something called Share Waste. So Share Waste is a really good website which links gardeners and composters up. So if, for example, you have a Bokashi bucket but nowhere to put that material, You can go on Share Waste and find someone in your local area that will accept that material for you. Likewise, if you have food scraps that you want to recycle, but you perhaps don't have the time or space or resources to compost them at home, you can collect your food scraps and take them to someone else for them to use in their compost bins or worm farms at home too. Same thing for community gardens as well. Community gardens are often located on Share Waste and will happily take local residents' materials too. So even if you can't set up one of these systems at home, there is options for you to recycle your food scraps in some way. Also being mindful of the maintenance. So a compost bin will require at least weekly maintenance, which is you mixing and turning that compost physically and aerating it too. Whereas the worm farm, you're just adding the food scraps and letting the worms go, and the Bokashi bucket again, adding the food scraps, adding your microorganism mix and letting it ferment away. Continuing on with that notion of if you don't have a compost bin or a worm farm to recycle food scraps, you can use your garden bin. So if you are a City of Greater Dandenong resident and you have a green lidded garden waste bin, you can now add all of your food scraps into that bin. Again, this can work really well if you're already home composting as well too, because it will take the materials that we don't traditionally compost. So it can take all of your meats, all of your off foods, rotten foods, all of your plate scrapings, dairy, all of your breads, grains and pasta too, all that sort of thing. So it takes all of your food scraps, not just fruit and vegetables. So that can work really well in conjunction with your compost bin too. Now, if you have a compost bin at home, we obviously don't want to tell you to stop composting. That's brilliant, keep composting, but you may find that there's those few different types of foods that you can also add to your green bin too. The green bin, you can also keep adding all of your garden materials as normal. You can add coffee and tea. Again, just no coffee pods, no tea bags. And you can also add serviettes, paper towel, napkins and tissues if you've used them in food preparation as well. As always, there's going to be a few things that we can't put in that green bin. So no fruit labels, stickers, rubber bands, making sure we remove all of those, similar to if we're composting at home. No types of packaging, even if it says compostable, biodegradable or degradable, please keep them out. It's just for food materials. So that's why it's called a food and garden waste bin. If it's food, it can go in. If it's garden waste, it can go in. So no animal waste, no vacuum dust, no hair, no soil, no rocks, and no plastic materials either. Excuse me. So that's pretty much everything from me. If you do have any questions, happy to spend the last little bit of our session answering them for you, regardless of which of those systems it's on. If you do want more information about the food waste recycling through your garden waste bin, the link there is on the slide for Council's food waste recycling page, as well as we have a page for compost bins and worm farms. So it has similar information to what we've covered off today, in case you sort of want to go back and have a look at anything. I'm going to put my email in the chat now. So if you do have any questions sort of, after you've processed this information, if as you're composting at home and you think of something else that you haven't thought of right now, you can flick me an email, that's totally fine. As well as if you'd like a copy of these slides. If you'd like these slides, please send me an email and I will send them out to you, as well as answering any further questions. So that's my email I've put in there now. Excuse me, Steph, you have asked if we can use food scraps in any other way before the composting process. So lots of ways that you can use food scraps. Yes, definitely. So going back to one of our first slides, we had that food waste hierarchy. We're recycling our food scraps through our compost bins or even that green garden waste bin. That's sort of lower down on the scale of things. Ideally, we want to be using our food scraps and our food as much as possible and then composting them. That's sort of that last process when there's nothing else left to do. So I guess one good one that I can share now is banana peels. If you haven't heard of banana skin fertilizer, it's a really quick, easy way to get some good fertilizer for your garden. So placing your banana skins in a jar of water, sealing it, letting it sit for a day or two, draining that liquid. And then what's happening is as those banana skins are soaking in that water, the wonderful nutrients, things like potassium, all those minerals that are in the banana skin is going to leak out into the water. And you add that water to your garden as a bit of a fertilizer. So that's a great way to use banana skins first before composting them as that last step. Heaps of other recipes on that Love Food Hate Waste website that I shared at the start too, that can get you started on a few ideas for using up your food scraps, things like that. Another example would be if you have lots of vegetable peelings, onion skins, things like that, you can perhaps make a vegetable stock. So storing all of your vegetable peelings and scraps like that, tops and tails, storing them in a container in the freezer when it's full, create a beautiful vegetable stock from those before then composting the food scraps when they're finished. But definitely lots of different ways you can use food scraps before composting. Getting the most out of our food is the best thing we want to do before composting at the end as well.
Blend it all together in a super blender, you know.
Yeah,
if you're really keen enough. I'd love to hear just how we can encourage people to sort of at least start. You mentioned keeping the compost bins close and convenient.
Yes.
But generally, you know, if people are just not even recycling yet and they're just chucking everything in a plastic bag and putting that outside, you know, whether it's composting or indeed getting people to kind of split up into at least recycling as well, you know, what are some sort of things that you've seen encourage and do allow people to at least give it a go, or any advice on kind of helping?
I think that's the absolute best messaging, is just give it a go. I think a lot of the time we find a lot of residents are really hesitant to compost because they think it's really difficult and hard to sort of get right. And yes, it is to an extent. To get that really super fantastic compost that's going to take a couple of weeks to break down, it does take a little while to get to that stage. But that doesn't mean if you get started now and you just start adding food scraps and garden material, giving it a mix, it is going to break down. It might take a little bit longer than an established composter, but at least you're doing it and you're diverting some of your waste too. So we don't want to sort of set the pedestal too high. Just have a go. It's a bit of trial and error at the start for composting, and you'll really learn your compost too as you go. Perhaps another way of getting started is just the worm farm, because it is really quite simple. You're just adding your food scraps and the worms eat it. There's not a lot of maintenance involved too. Even if you're not recycling all of your food scraps, if you're just getting started by diverting a little bit at the start to get, once you're sort of getting in the process of things, then that's a wonderful bonus for the environment too. We don't need everybody doing this perfectly. We just need everybody sort of getting started and making those little changes. That's going to have a really big collective impact when we're talking about reducing our food waste.
And is there anything that we should avoid? I know kind of certain citrus and bones and even eggs, if they're not crumpled down, you know, do you have any other kind of no-nos for the compost bin and worm farms?
Not really, not aside from what we popped in the slides. I guess citrus is a myth in your compost bin. A lot of people think we can't put citrus in the compost because we don't like giving it to our worm farms. That comes down to the fact that they're different species. So although citrus is a no-no in our worm farms, we don't want to change the acidity of their soil, it is totally fine in your compost bin. So long as we're avoiding meat and dairy in our compost, any fruit and vegetable scrap is totally fine.
Cool. Perfect. And how else do you think we can kind of communicate the message of not just looking at the kind of smelly scraps as something that's kind of a leftover, but a potential for creating something else? Because I think especially with young kids, it's like almost teaching that the end of something's life cycle, whether it's a tree pass, animal passing, or indeed food passing, that kind of process does lead back to the flowers blooming and then us being able to grow food from stuff. Like, do you have any advice for communicating that kind of life cycle component of composting?
I guess that sort of goes back to what we were talking about at the start with the circular economy. And a lot of that is just a change in the way that we think, which is probably the hardest thing to possibly change. And it's just that change in our mindset from waste to resource, or we also talk about changing things from our mindset from rubbish to resource. So instead of thinking of waste as something that, you know, it's out of sight, out of mind, is to always thinking about, well, how can we give this thing another life? And especially that being our food scraps. I think what we also find is a lot of kids tend to know this a little bit more than what our parents do in the adult generations. A lot of kids are really doing this at school already. Most schools will have compost bins and worm farms. And also when we go and do school sessions and you say who has a compost bin, who has a worm farm at home, probably 80% of the class will put their hands up. So it might be that you're composting at home, but your kids aren't involved. Get the kids involved. Worm farms are a really great one to do that as well. I have an 18-month-old and she knows when we go into the backyard, she starts saying compost because I get her to help me put the food scraps into the compost bin. She helps me mix and turn it. Same for our worm farm. She likes looking at and holding the worms. She says hello to them. It's all about making the process fun and just getting them involved. And I think the same goes for us as adults too, goes back to what we said before, just give it a go, get involved. You might find it's a lot easier than you thought. Hopefully you'll enjoy it too, because when we're doing this at home with these systems, we're getting something for our efforts. We're getting compost, we're getting a liquid fertilizer. We're then adding that to our gardens and we'll see the benefits of that as our plants grow as well, which is really, really great.
Awesome. And I'd love to and thank you very much for answering all of these questions.
No,
and,
that's my pleasure.
Maybe just and I think yeah, just to clarify with the eggshells, I know you said meat and dairy, but are eggshells a no-no or what's the go?
Yeah, eggshells, you can definitely place eggshells into the compost bin. What you will find for eggshells though, regardless of if they go in a compost bin or a worm farm, is that they won't decompose like the rest of our food scraps do. It's similar as to if you put a bone into your compost bin, it's not going to break down. Which is why we avoid bones. But eggshells, because they're made from, they're quite rich in calcium, they're just a bit of what we call a compost booster. So they're going to add extra nutrients to your compost bin and your soil. So if you do want to add them, the best way to do it, if you've got the time and the patience, is to sort of dry them out and then grind them down to a bit of a powder and sprinkle that through your compost bin. But if you don't have the time or can't be bothered, just try and crush them up a little bit with your hands so that the pieces are a bit smaller. So you will see them in your finished compost, but that's fine. It's just going to help add nutrients to the soil.
And you can also stick them if you've got a stick that you're turning. You can kind of mash up the eggs a little.
Yeah.
And I'd love to Hannah to hear a bit of kind of the permaculture approach for managing either a big garden or a farm, and how maybe just some either plugins or outputs from a compost worm system that contribute to, that kind of interconnected permaculture system. So anything on like what can come in and what and how it can support.
Yeah, what actually happens if we go back to the food and garden waste bin, looking at on a larger scale, everything that we put into your green lidded bin gets turned into compost sort of on a very large commercial scale. And all of that compost is actually going back to our agriculture. So the materials that you put in your green bin, they get turned into a compost material. Although we're not using that benefit directly into our gardens, when we look at it from that bigger picture and when we talk about closing the loop and having a circular economy where we're turning our materials into a resource, that's all going back to our farmers in Victoria. And there it's going to really help improve the quality of our soil structure. A lot of what's happening at the moment is we have urban expansion and we're building our suburbs further and further out. We're reducing the viability of our soil and we're reducing sort of the areas suited to farming. So being able to add this compost material helps rebuild the soil structure as well as adding nutrients. And it's also an organic way to do so. There's no chemicals, there's no artificial fertilizers. It's just beautiful compost that we've made from our food and garden materials from our homes. So I think that helps build into that idea too of turning our rubbish into a resource. It's not just going into a bin where it gets sent away or we don't know about it. It's actually getting used on growing the fruit and vegetables that we then eat, which we might then be using those scraps to compost at home or placing back in our food and garden waste bin, where that cycle just continues, whether it's at home or on that larger commercial agricultural scale too.
And thank you very much. And one final note is, if you keep the worms in the full sun, I found that up here in the summer when it's not raining, they can get fried. Is that,
Yes,
you
they definitely
mentioned in
do.
the sun, so is there a kind of middle ground with the shade, or any recommendations on just picking a spot that's kind of suitable in winter and in summer, or do you kind of need to move it around a bit?
Yeah, so for your compost bin, you won't need to move it. It doesn't matter that your compost bin's in full sun in the summer. If it gets quite hot, your earthworms, they'll just move around. They'll also tolerate a higher temperature than the little worms that we have in our worm farm. So if you do have to keep your worm farm outside, if you can, 100% needs to be in a shady location. So perhaps under an awning, or if you don't have sort of, a backyard that's got an undercover area, even if you've got a bit of a table that you can put them under, just so they're not in the direct sunlight, because they'll definitely get fried. It can happen here in sunny Melbourne too. And then I suppose in those summer months, if you do have the option to move them inside into your garage or laundry or anywhere that you've got space spare, that's ideal, so they don't get too hot. But as I mentioned earlier too, if you don't have that option, you can use that frozen ice block to place into your worm farm to help cool that worm farm down, so that they're not going to get fried in summer too. But yeah, that's sort of the best one we can do, is change those locations. So at least that's the handy thing about the worm farm, is they can get a little bit heavy, but they're quite mobile too, so we can move them around, whereas the compost bin we just leave in the one spot.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate you being very comprehensive. I've definitely learned some awesome bits.
My pleasure.
And thank you for sharing this afternoon. I'd love to end on what's something that you're just generally hopeful about, and whether it is worm related or compost related or managing our waste. It doesn't need to be, but just generally across the board with what's happening with sustainability, and a bit of a pendulum shift towards caring more about our ecosystems and waste, and all of these conversations being discussed in Foreverfest. I'm curious what generally you're pretty hopeful about looking forward into 2030 or so.
I think I'm quite passionate about food waste and making sure that we're using it to the best of our abilities. It doesn't really make sense when you think about it of why we put it into our garbage bins at all, because it's not getting used and it's just taking up space in our landfill. So if we can just get that slight mindset to shift away from it's just rubbish, I can't use it anymore, to thinking, well, actually, no, there is something else I can do with this, whether that's getting started at home composting or just using your green bin home too. So I think that's the biggest one for us here in the city of Greater Dandenong, is if you have that green bin with the green lid, if you can start adding your food scraps, even if it's just a little bit at a time while you're getting started, that small amount that you're doing is going to have quite a large impact. If we can get as many residents doing that as possible, that's a really, really big win for us. And I think a big win for everybody who's doing that themselves is to know that they're playing their part in their community in helping to reduce the waste that we're sending to landfill. I think that's a really, really big bonus.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing today, Hannah, and all of your work towards, touching the community and actually making this stuff go out. So yeah, really appreciate your time and expertise.
My pleasure. Thank you.
No worries. Enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you. Happy composting, everybody.
Indeed. Lots ahead.